everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much to Professor Robert Derby for accepting the class's invitation, and to Dominican Wolf for his leadership in making this invitation possible. I am Hector Hoyos, the faculty director of the center. For those of you new to Bolívar House, I think we have all met before. Our Friday speaker series doubles as a class, and so the students in the MA program have prepared some amazing questions involving Taino, the Taino past, pigs, cows, dogs, Columbus, and the figure of Bêtes Noires. I'm looking at some of the keywords here already, and I'm very excited with those. This is also an opportunity to bring Haiti specialists together and to think of Latin America in the broad sense. As we all know, there would be no Latin America had it not been for Haiti. Hence the French word Latin, and there's Latin. Is other to the Spanish crown, the Portuguese crown, but also, you know, the French Empire. I am going to cede the floor to Professor Michael Wolf, who is going to introduce our speaker. Professor Wolf is an associate professor in history. He's a specialist on environmental history. He's written about Cuba, also about Mexico, and he is teaching our core seminar this quarter for the MA program. Professor Wolf.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you my very good colleague and friend, Professor Robin Derby. Professor Derby's research has treated dictatorship in everyday life, the longue durée social history of the Haitian and Dominican border, and how notions of race, national identity, and witchcraft have been articulated in popular media such as rumor, food, and animals. Her publications include the prize-winning, and I think prize-winning is not enough to say, it won the Bolton Prize, which is an amazing prize for all of the Americas. The Dictator Seduction, Politics and the Popular Imagination in the Era of Trujillo, the co-authored Terreur de Frontières, le Massacre des Haitiens en République Dominicaine en 1937, published in 2021, and the co-edited Dominican Republic Reader. So her current project, actually, this is her published book about which she is going to talk today. It's based on oral testimony of demonic animal phantasms in Haiti and the DR, and considers, doesn't werewolf encounters in light of the animal turn? Or have we not gotten to that chapter yet? We still have about 3 more chapters to read for the master's students next week. Anyway, Professor Derby can let us know. So it's called Bêtes Noires, Sorcery as History in the Haitian-Dominican Borderlands. It's published by Duke University Press. And her title, she's currently Professor of History at UCLA, where she teaches courses on modern Latin American and Caribbean history, cultural history, and food studies. And that's where we met. I was there for 2 years from 2010 to 2012, and really enjoyed many conversations with Professor Derby at that time. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me here and to share my work. I'm really excited to get your feedback. And I wanted to start with a couple of minutes of the kind of music which is very melancholic, which you hear in the Haitian-Dominican borderlands. It's a subset of bachata called amargue. And this is a song that was super hot during many of my visits in particular.
Ya se acabó lo bonito, ya no hay pasión en nuestra habitación, solo hay frío. Ya no queda nada lindo, aquel amor que sentíamos los dos se ha perdido. Ahora la soledad se sienta a hablar conmigo. porque sabe muy bien que ya no estoy contigo.
Okay, so this presentation seeks to explain narratives of encounter with a particularly feared genre of shape-shifting phenomena called baka, spirit beings that are deployed to steal or protect farm animals. And bacás are spirit demons created by sorcerers, which present as dogs, pigs, horses, and cattle, and help amass wealth. But butchers told me about sheep that meowed, goats with pigs' tails, and bulls that cried like a baby, creatures which were really bacá or spirit animals. They may be pigs sold at market with human fingernails, or cows that talk or cry, and they must most often present as dogs, pigs, or cattle, not wolves, which are not present on the island of Hispaniola. I heard haunting stories about invisible visitations and how they were eradicated, struggles in the bush by virile men who fought off these beasts, ranchers and butchers' tales about bacás that eviscerated their herds and drained their cash. Workers resisted cruel employers by secretly stealing their crops via bacá, just as heroic men protect their families and the nation from feral packs of bacá streaming over the border from Haiti. I first discovered these spirit demons in animal form during a visit to the Dominican border town of Bôdica in 2008, which fits squarely on the divisory line with Haiti. Down there. See. This project has carefully followed the contours of these stories, which I've followed up with historical materials to trace the longue durée history of animals on the island, which seems central since my first research question was why animals were accorded so much agency in these accounts. In this presentation, I'll convey a few of the arguments I developed in this book. Bacás are a particular subset of shapeshifter lore, but these beliefs are equally Haitian and Dominican, rural and urban. The version of bacá narratives interpreted here are specific to the central frontier, where they appear to be a branch of Haitian vodou, sorcery lore, in which the core feature is the anthropomorphism of the object, that the stick, rock, or dog is actually a person. In Haiti, accusations that beef was really human flesh even landed several people in jail on cannibalism charges in the 1870s during the anti-superstition campaign. A form of assault sorcery, the bacá is sent to secretly enact symbolic violence against others, which is morally reprehensible and thus must occur in the form of an authorless crime. In Haiti, bacá are classed with secret societies which are greatly feared, such as the bisongo, which become ferocious dogs at night, or the cochons sans poil, the hairless pigs, which shed their skin and prowl around as bones. And shapeshifting has become a motif of Haitian national identity since the Haitian Revolution. It is said that Macandal, who started the slave revolt through poisoning French livestock, escaped the wrath of French troops by becoming a mosquito, which he bragged about. Clearly, werewolves are good to think with, as Claude Lévi-Strauss would say, but what can they tell us? For one, as narratives of the spirit world, they are stories of the supernatural that implot change in and through the body, and thus can be read as expressions of particular understandings of personhood and corporality, in which metaphysical experience is known through the sensory field, something that anthropologists of West Africa studied. They're also evidence of a culture of proximity with death, which is characteristic of Central West African Kikongo culture, one in which the portal between this world and that one is always slightly ajar. As an oral historian, I've tried to stray away from the cold transcription in this project in favor of a methodology that brings the body back into oral storytelling for several reasons. One, because these demons are often not cognized, but rather felt, described as a presence evidenced by a cold shudder or visualized as a black cloud in one's dreams. People rarely conceive of these demons, but sense them first. Second, so they're not visual like our ghost narratives. They're more sensory. Second, I've found that working with a video camera has enabled me to observe the effective resonance of events that I could not grasp otherwise. And these spirit demons are first and foremost vectors of intense emotion. For example, when I started my life narrative of the day laborer, who's the lowest strata in this rural community. His body language was subdued and hunched over, his language passive and oblique. But when he started talking about his encounter with the bacá, he got up and enacted it. His voice got stronger. It became clear to me that his identity lay not in his work identity, but rather when he engaged in a pitched battle with the bacá and became a hero fighting it back. Let me explain this phenomenon through the words of some of my informants. As Hehel Sabila told me, and he was named Hehel because his father was related to philosophy. What people say is that there are lots and lots of animals, lots and lots and lots of animals, steers, dairy cattle, goats, pigs, horses, and no one takes care of them. No one minds these animals, understand? Nono, for example, has something that takes care of his things. He has a bacá that takes care of them. No one steals them. No one watches them. They don't get lost. They don't stray. They're not fenced in, yet they don't stray. And how many trucks does he have? Today, Nono has one, but before he had so much money compared to everyone else in that time in the Dominican Republic. He had millions of pesos. For the 1990s, he had way too much money and no one knew where it came from. Thus, the bacá can be a sign of occult illicit wealth. It can also represent a hidden form of agency as a mode of subaltern resistance or escape. Colón, whose nickname is Columbus, which is an important detail, who served as manager of El Manicero, a very important vegetable oil processing plant in the 1980s, elaborated further on the use of a bacá as a supernatural assistant. In those days, people had these pájaros, these creatures, to protect their livestock. People would have them around the house and they would do what they wanted them to do. They would also go to the farm and they would bring the animals to their owners. A bacá can assume the shape of a person or a cow or a goat or a dog. They come from Haiti, but Dominicans have them too, especially people with money. They would be sent to steal livestock. This happened a lot. They can be sent to steal crops. These are people who wanted to acquire wealth without working. In one of my visits, Javier Sedano killed himself with a shotgun, but immediately afterwards, stories emerged that his first cousin, the mayor Roberto, had actually killed him. The evidence being sightings of a mysterious herd of cattle across the border in Haiti. Roberto seemed to have an income stream beyond his earnings and had been the target of allegations of drug and human trafficking of Haitian laborers who is said to have to transport across the border in his fancy truck. These tales are alarming reminders that evil is never dormant, it just gestates in the presumption that there is an invisible hand enabling profit to accrue to some and not others. These stories also indicate a profoundly suspicious view of wealth accusation. But we still need to explain the presence of animals in these accounts. It has been said that the Caribbean is a crucible of modernity since plantation slavery fueled European industrialization and the ingenio or sugar mill was the precursor to the modern factory. So it should come as no surprise that from indigenous peoples and Africans to sea turtles and manatees, the Caribbean was also the ground zero of species extinction, as more fauna have vanished there in the last century than anywhere else in the world. As one writer dramatically put it, the Caribbean is the world's largest laboratory of extinction. Mammal diversity in the Caribbean began to erode with the first arrival of humans as large sloths and monkeys, as well as a variety of rodents vanished. But Columbus's arrival caused a veritable scourge of animal death, as manatees, utias, solenodon, turtles, and many bird species disappeared as victims of non-native species introduction, as well as human predation. Out of 130 species today, only 13 mammals and 6 bat species remain. Indeed, the Natural History Museum of Havana today has the feel of a morgue. Cuban literary critic Antonio Benitez Rojo, author of The Repeating Island, has noted that much of Caribbean cultural memory resides in the environment. Yet this is one which has been brutally assaulted by the plantation system, a precocious paradigm of industrialization. No wonder the countryside of Haiti and the Dominican Republic is haunted today by animal specters. Caribbean scholars have not focused much on the role of animals in the social history of the Caribbean, yet they played a central role in the evisceration of the indigenous population of Hispaniola. Christopher Columbus arrived on the north coast of La Hispaniola in 1492, commencing the extractive colonial economy, which caused the dramatic demise of the largest Amerindian population in the Caribbean. But his arrival had an important animal component to it as well. The story of human-animal codependence accompanied by massive violence and death. In 1494, on Columbus's second voyage to the Caribbean, he returned with 17 ships, 1,200 men, 6 mares, 6 cows, pigs, donkeys, poultry, 1,600 sheep, and various cats and dogs as seed animals to provision the new colonists as La Española became the vestibule to the Americas, which went on to spread extensive ranching to New Spain, Venezuela, and beyond. The North American colonists brought livestock to service agriculture, but in sharp contrast, the Iberian model placed animals at the center, not the periphery. European cows, horses, dogs, and pigs thrived in this environment as the Andalusian culture of extensive cattle production took root amidst the tropical forests and grasslands. Cattle proliferated extravagantly with reports of a 10-fold increase in 3 or 4 years. These feral beasts that multiplied marvelously were actually invasive species that thrived on the abundant foliage, wreaking havoc on the ecosystem and contributing to the rapid demise of the indigenous Taino population. Looming far larger than all the other quadrupeds on the island, the largest creature on Hispaniola was a hutia, which is a large rodent, before Columbus arrived. Some of these beasts were also agents of terror, a fact which the conquistadores deployed to their advantage, making the horse and the dog especially central players in the domination of the Taino indigenous population. Contemporaries noted the look of astonishment on the part of the Amerindians when horses first arrived, and later, in an effort to render these quadrupeds even more frightening, the Spanish laced strings of bells across their mounts in battle so as to augment their otherworldly aura. But surely it was the fact that the indigenous were hunted and lanced en masse with dogs from atop these martial steeds that rendered them terrifying, as horses, men, and canines worked together in lethal squads. The reports that the horse and rider in their military garb were perceived as single beings by the indigenes as monstrous centaurs, and the Spanish sought to augment these terrifying rumors of their own supernatural immortality by carefully hiding horse corpses when they died. Indeed, it is significant that the first indigenous image painted after the arrival of the Spanish did not represent the powerful technology that they brought with them, the battleships and the guns. Rather, it sketched the terrifying sight of a man on horseback. Bacá narratives raise many questions. But the first conundrum is why the bacá almost invariably appears as the seed animals brought first to Hispaniola by Columbus. The feral dogs, cattle, horses, and pigs, which were the first line of attack during the conquest and which are now extinct. Witchcraft studies have not considered the significance of the demonic host on the grounds that in the Anglo-American model, whether the beast was an ass or an ox or a black horse, it was a manifestation of the singular embodiment of evil, Lucifer. But the semantics of animals in bacá apparitions are not arbitrary or contingent. I want to make the case that these narratives can be a source for what historian Ranaji Pujas has called the small voices of history. But this requires taking stock of the animal historical traces in these accounts. This study considers these animal hosts as repositories of popular memory derived from a long durée history of multi-species entanglements on La Española that carry sensory, aesthetic, and ontological traces. The many meanings of non-human animals in this case are far more than just symbolic. Animals have long played leading roles as technologies of domination and terror, material sustenance, codependent laboring partners, sacrificial beasts, companion animals, as well as inspiration for animal metaphors such as identity assertions and mimetic alter egos in pseudonyms, fables, nicknames, jokes, storytelling, carnival masquerade, and even providing an idiom of ludic sexual innuendo in everyday speech. The particular animals invoked in these narratives have ritual value because of the acute emotional resonance they invoke, whether despised as vicious attack dogs that hunted slaves, or later beloved as hunting commons, which enabled the privilege of autonomy at a time when slavery was the rule for people of color. If the animal long served as other in Europe, this was not the case within slave contexts in which slaves were classed with and often lived and worked intimately with farm animals. In a context in which they likely provided a modicum of solace under brutal conditions, or in post-emancipation societies in which subsistence peasants unattached to plantations could be demeaned as just as lowly as free-range pigs. Yet these phantasmic sightings also indicate an element of African-American trickster heroism's defiant refusal to mourn, as popular storytelling and playful speech acts in the idiom of the carnivalesque refuse the elegiac and instead insist on jouissance and empowerment in the face of harsh challenges. I wish to argue that baka stories are cultural performances of haunted landscapes where assemblages of the dead gather together with the living. Thus, they convey the experience of being haunted and hunted by predatory spirits in animal form that conjure the experience of terror wrought by the animals that enabled colonial conquest and beyond in conditions of domination and precarity. These emotionally dense animals serve as charged mnemonics, which are apprehended somatically in tales of everyday furtive encounters with frightening beastly demons, as well as more playful forms, such as roasting and eating them in patron saint festivals. This is for the Feast of San Francisco. Masquerading as them in carnival and joking about them as sex objects in carnal humor. These baka stories reveal that the trauma of conquest lives on, unresolved within implicit social knowledge, as these apparitions of spectral animal demons forge a never-ending revisiting of the animal terror that created the lingering trouble in the first place. The visceral dread evoked by these animal demons, I propose, are a material manifestation of what Dominicans call the fukú de Colón, the curse of Columbus, a popular taboo surrounding even uttering the name of Columbus due to the scourge he unleashed. Over time, the new sights and sounds and smells came to convey the horror of these animals, forming a sensory memory in which these beastly traces conjure up a visceral reaction of dread. Dogs in particular were trained as attack animals to hunt escaped Indians and Africans, disembowel their victims, and were fed their flesh as a reward. As Las Casas haunting images graphically remind us, indigenous body parts were even sold as dog food in market, since they were seen as non-human. Indeed, it was on La Española that barking at fugitive Indians, because Santo Domingo was the hub of indigenous slavery before we have the African slaves arrive. That fugitive Indians paralyzed with fear came to be called dogging, as sicking attack canines on Amerindians became a verb, and of course attack dogs were also used to hunt slaves, African slaves. By the 18th century, bull mastiffs became a major export from Cuba to hunt fugitive slaves, and thus a major tool of slave terror in the Caribbean. In addition to these new smells of gunshot, the soundscape of these enormous beasts snorting, barking, snarling, braying, and stampeding must have been particularly frightening given the silence of the previous landscape. Of small, softly shuffling hutillas and silent lizards, a land where even the dogs didn't bark because barkless dogs were raised by the Taino as a food source. Since the indigenous Taino hunted at night, they surely must have collided with feral boars. The fact that pigs are nocturnal predators must have contributed to their image as a harbinger of death, and as did their capacity for violence when only comparable to the wild dog. You saw how big these feral animals for this Feast for San Francisco, they're huge. This history helps explain later uses of these animal icons as a sign of power within Haitian and Dominican voodoo, such as the use of a horse tail as a power object, a zombie, which appears in the form of a steer, a dog's skull used as a wanga, or a fetish used to protect from jackals called the chien de buisson, the bush dog, or the inclusion of cattle horns in altars, or the fact that the horse rider semis, which were Taino power objects, began to appear in caves where indigenous peoples took refuge, hid their ritual paraphernalia, and died as they possibly sought to acquire some of the Iberians' ferocious might. This history helps explain why the dog and the horse serve as the primordial gateways to the spirit world within Haitian and Dominican voodoo, because the horse is the vector of the spirit. The person is called a horse when the spirit comes down. The story of animals on Hispaniola did not end with Columbus, however. Right? While the rest of the Caribbean turned towards sugar, by sharp contrast, the Dominican economy peaked in the late 18th century through provisioning cattle for the highly successful sugar economy of neighboring Saint-Domingue, today Haiti, which became the largest producer, the world's largest producer of sugar in the late 18th century. The entire economy was reoriented towards cattle ranching, much of it passing through the central frontier en route to the Artibonite Valley, where most sugar plantations were located. Oxen were used as the principal technology for the sugar mills and for interior transport, but the meat was also consumed and blood was used in the sugar refining process. Cattle became a currency, enabling the acquisition of slaves and luxury goods, which had been out of reach previously to the Spanish side of the island, as cattle, horses, and mules were swapped for rum, cloth, and clothing. As the Haitian Revolution brought down the thriving sugar economy, the 19th century saw the emergence of a hunting commons of wild boars and goats, which enabled the Dominican peasantry the luxury of remaining outside of slavery while it raged in neighboring Puerto Rico and Cuba until the late 19th century. Bacá narratives, however, do not just convey animal histories, they also concern race. I wish to propose that the loathsome bacá is not just a figure of wondrous nature, it's also a figure of race. The bacá is black in more ways than one. It can appear as a little black dwarf, but it also channels the idea of blackness as a stealthy, latent, and nascent power that is feared and must be controlled. It thus invokes the mixed race mestizo idea of blackness as not necessarily self-evident, but rather latent. There's something black about the sense of threat posed by the bacá. It is the barely discernible bacá lurking in the shadows, ready to pounce, that represents an unconsumed surplus of danger. The image of the bacá channeling the wild French Negroes formed part of the Gothic narratives of Haiti that commenced with the whites fleeing the Haitian Revolution. Bacá shapeshifting is most notorious as a technique of slave camouflage deployed during the Haitian Revolution and served as the inspiration for the literary genre Alejo Carpentier, described as lo real maravilloso, magical realism born of Haitian Maroon leader Macandal, who hid from authorities by shapeshifting. This motif continues to hold force as a Bacá idiom since the Dominican strongman Rafael Trujillo and Tawny outlaws like Charmin Perrault were said to have these powers of transformation, as well as notorious Tonton Macoute. Oops. Let me go back. Shoot. I lost it. Okay. Yes, there we go, the dogs, who were able to transform into dogs who were then often from lower social strata and thus darker in hue. These rumors were based on Duvalier's brutal henchman Clément Barbeau. The dog slide, it's front. It's the book with the dog. Forward. There we go, thanks. Okay, so these rumors were based on Duvalier's brutal henchman Clément Barbeau's amazing escape from prison, in which it was said he did so by turning into a black dog. Throwing up on the imagery of blood and soil, sex and violence, Bacá narratives are also a discourse of Gothic cultural alterity, which renders Haitian vectors of covert violence, as well as powerful magical protection and sorcery throughout the Caribbean. Finally, I propose that the Bacá encounters are also theaters of masculine performance in which plebeian men can burnish their profile as men of agency and mobility as they fight off and narrowly escape these spirit demons. Dominican rural areas have been sorely neglected since the 1980s as traditional exports such as sugar, cacao, and tobacco have collapsed. Countries turn towards tourism, and women today have better education and job prospects than men. The rural mood of male despondencies is reflected in the popularity of the melancholic música de la margue, a form of bachata in rural areas. These stories thus also should be seen as African-American male trickster tales that celebrate everyday rogues and heroes, underclass men who escape everyday dangers on their own without the help of others, only through their wit and cunning. As such, these forms of disguise could be seen as a veiled discourse of dignity and self-assertion, offering symbolic resistance to forms of everyday domination, which hold appeal due to the long history of slavery, and which were particularly satisfying due to the ways they challenged the public transcript of deference requisite within the corridors of power. Am I running out of time? Am I running on too long? Okay. Narratives of encounter with the bacá also highlight the mobility of the narrator who encounters the bacá on a nocturnal journey and thus convey a highly prized sense of freedom, mastery, and empowerment, of course, unavailable to slaves. Bacá stories have elements shared with the popular genre of the tigre, a deeply Dominican dramatis personae, which is this local variant of the trickster who is a popular folk hero throughout former slave societies, the good rogue who persecutes the powerful. Unlike San Miguel, however, he does not defeat his supernatural opponent. Instead, he just narrowly escapes it via the age-old dexterous skill of the disempowered, what anthropologist Roberto D'Amata calls the clever dodge. The tigre is a survivor who emerges in any situation, his audacity and courage, reflecting the experience and values of the underclasses. The tigre is a social climber who uses his verbal dexterity and hyperfluency as a means of social ascent. Unlike the social avenger, he does not seek to destroy his opponent, but rather to shrewdly outmaneuver it. In narrowly escaping the claws of the demonic monster, these stories reverse the arrows of the relationship as the underdog is transformed into a figure of power. They also underscore the uniqueness of the individual skills of the protagonist as a survivor. The tigre is thus, by definition, an individual who succeeds himself is elevating himself above his peers in a context of informality. This helps explain bacá narratives showcase the cunning of the protagonist as well as the I'm good, I think. Bacá narratives showcase the cunning of the protagonist as well as the pleasure of taking on an opponent in a ritual context. An important detail, since facing off with an adversary highlights the activity as opposed to passivity of the narrator, and especially since competition, rivalry, and seduction are the masculine troika par excellence. But they're not the only four of this kind. Popular Caribbean male pastimes such as decima recitation, is a form of poetry, has long been an everyday art form showcased at the rural colmado or grocery store. You also have cockfighting. You have these ritual bet contests in forms of carnival. This is the case for ritual events such as minor carnival traditions such as the Máscaras del Diablo, in which men in teams dress up in makeshift costumes and then whip the opposing team in contests. So as such, these narratives should be seen as speech acts which conform to a broader idiom of Afro-Atlantic masculine displays of male courage and skill present in ritual contexts such as carnival, martial traditions such as Rara, which is a Haitian form of carnival, which occur around Easter, and individualistic displays such as the popular male swagger that you have in the Guédé-inspired vagabond, who's a popular figure in Haiti, or the West Indian rude boys. As folklorist Bauman has argued, these verbal displays should be seen as cultural performances that demonstrate the manly valor of the protagonist as he skillfully resists confrontation with a supernatural foe, thus becoming a man of worth. Has been argued for dogfighting. Men earn their manhood through altercations through bacá. Okay, so to conclude, Christina Sharp has written eloquently about how living in the wake means grounding the history and present of terror at the core of Black existence. These bacá apparitions thus must also be seen as acts of witnessing and mourning, with several layered meanings, first in response to the horror of mass death and of Amerindians and African slaves, later becoming extinction narratives mourning feral animal commons that long sustained these freedmen outside of slavery. If at times traumatic events are silenced as the result of a taboo, by contrast, bacá sightings seem to obsessively revisit the violence brought by conquest as these cursed animals shadow, hunt, and terrorize contemporary residents on the island. Sketching the contours of a longue durée culture of multi-species and engagement multi-species engagement and animal phototenics, I suggest, helps explain the extraordinary prominence of pigs, cattle, and goats in Haitian-Dominican popular culture, from tall acts to shape-shifting beliefs. Oops. Ooh. I'm missing my little video clip, which I'm about to This form of historical excavation is also an act of witnessing, since the feral ecoscape of Hispaniola is now all but lost, since the putia, manatee, and wild cattle were promiscuously slaughtered, and the last Creole Boers were eviscerated in the 1979 USAID-sponsored swine flu eradication program. We cannot bring back the once teeming ecosystem of Hispaniola, but we can reconstruct its contours through historical research, since it has been said that storytelling is one of the great arts of witness. And now I just wanted to show a clip where you can get a sense of the enactment of these furtive encounters in person.
Dimension.
Yo sí he peleado con bacá y no le valen porque se joden conmigo. Una vez, yo le hice un trabajo a Nicasio el día que tú lo conociste de Salinas. Yo le rompí 40 tareas de terreno. Después que le acabé su trabajo, no me lo quería pagar. Ese hombre tenía un bacá. Tú lo sabes bien que es un hombre malo, maligno. Un día le acabo su trabajo y voy allá y le digo, bueno, yo vine a buscar mi dinero porque yo soy un hombre pobre y necesito. ¿Y qué va? No hizo caso, estaba en la gallera. No hizo caso. Digo, que me paguen mi dinero, que ya es de noche. Y yo tengo que ir muy lejos y es a pie que voy en una montaña. ¿Sabes lo que hizo? Te voy a pagar tu dinero. Y vino y me lo pagó. Pero más atrás de mí echó el bacá de él para que me coma por el camino. Pero digo, a él o ella. Yo sé 3 oraciones que yo puedo pelear con 50 vacas. Cuando voy cruzando ayer el río de Naranjo, arriba se cayó una mate cacheo. Y ya yo no me veo la palma en la mano, ya de la oscuridad que hay. Viene y me salió ese puerco así grande, así, prieto. Y me dio 3 hondones arriba de una mate, de una barce vaya onda así, con las estuchas así. Y anda, me jodí. Todas esas espinas me se metían en el espinazo. Me recordé en la última hondión que me dio, me recordé de la primera oración que yo sé. Eso fue en Haitiana en Haití que me la dio a mí, para que yo me defendiera. Le rezo la primera oración. Vine, me volteé la ropa, revine, pam, 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 le recé la otra. Como a 20 barras del monte me dice, ya él va en reculía. Ya dentro del monte, como a 20 varas, me vocea de allá, ya dentro del monte. Ya me voy. Contigo no fue ni el diablo, pues. Digo, ven ahora, que nosotros nos vamos a enfrentar ahora, ven. Ven, pero ya el hombre está fuerte. Digo, ven, que ahora que nosotros vamos a pelear de a duro. De ahí se fue. De ahí para adelante, me se encadenó, me encalacó una gallinita blanca de esas enanas. Y me hacía carrato así por el talón del pantalón. Y esa gallinita me llevó hasta la puerta de mi casa, que entré a la puerta de mi casa. Jamás la vi. Y eso fue el bacá para que me comiera por el camino, por mi cuarto. Pero no pudo conmigo. Esas son 3 oraciones que las rezo yo y tiembla la casa como un temblor de tierra. Lo que sí que tú pones una cosa con bacá y el bacá te hace hasta rico. Que el bacá le quita la flor a ti y me la pone a mí. El tuyo no echa a nadie, el mío. Porque lo dicen los cafeteros de polo también. Pero si tú no cumples, mira, acaba contigo. Te deja así a plan raso.
De eso no me pregunte usted nada, de bacá yo no
I
entiendo.
think he's
El
an
único
evangelical.
Right. Ese es el bueno para mí. No. No quiero saber esos pájaros de ninguna manera. Yo no trabajo con eso. Yo trabajo a la voluntad de Cristo.
That's it. I think I hope you have some. This helps illustrate these stories, but I have to say it took me a long time to understand what was going on in these stories about there's a hen over here and there's a pig over here, and it took me a long time to figure out that they were not animals, right? Because he's in an environment where a lot of people keep these farm animals, but these were not farm animals. So just this kind of, I think that you can see the performativity, the masculinity, but you can also, you get a sense of how it was hard to figure these stories out.
Thank you very much. time for questions. The floor is open, especially to MA students who can ask no question or one question they have formulated. Please.
Hi, Professor Derby. My name is Luca. I wanted to thank you for sending us the images from your book we're using in our presentation yesterday, which went really well. I guess I'm curious more about the bacá in relation to mass violence in the shared histories of DR and Haiti. So, example of the bacá after the 37 Parsi massacre, and then also, as you mentioned, in relation to Duvalier and more about that.
Well, that's a great point. So the baka is a vector of violence, often unseen violence. The stories, this is where I first learned about the baka, when I was doing oral histories with the survivors of the Haitian massacre in 1937, which I don't call Haitian massacre anymore because they actually were Dominicans. I call it that 1937. It just slipped just now. But the farm animals that the Haitians left behind when they fled were said to be baka. You should not touch those because they were cursed. Which is also interesting because it's an aspect of the massacre which never gets. I mean, I interviewed the survivors as well as the victims, and I think those stories register a profound unease with the killing. And that's something that's often lost in the representations of the massacres, that Dominicans were horrified. And the message that Trujillo, I mean, the victims were Haitian, but the message was, you're next if you don't get in line. And that's what I heard in the killer narratives. Absolutely. So I think that baka story is about a certain identification with the Haitians. That was very profound. And I've shared my interviews with people, and they always hear it differently, often because the narrative that Dominicans are ethno-nationalists and phobic about their own race is so profound out there that I don't think people can always hear that message, the profound identification. That, I mean, this material also, like, he got a protective message from the Haitian woman. And so Haitian magic is super valued. It's frightening and powerful, but it's also necessary to protect from the evil, creatures that lurk out there. So, I mean, that's a message I send with some ambivalence out there in the book, because I feel like, the ethno-nationalist narrative has gotten a little too, it needs some nuance, shall we say, that this is a state narrative that you don't really see in the Central Frontier. I mean, there is inequality, absolutely. Haitians are more likely to be selling natural materials at market, and Dominicans will be selling, metallic things. I mean, I noticed that detail. But Haitians are adopted. I mean, there's a whole practice of adoption, which is also very controversial literature. Like the woman I stayed with, I recently wrote a piece about her Doña Pico's story. So she's the head of the Cofradia. When I went to do a life narrative with her, she said, I said, where were you born? She said, a Dominican place. And then she went, oh, mentira. No, I'm from Haiti. I'm from Tomasik. And it's interesting because she came as what we call a restavek in the literature, and the literature describes them as slaves. And there are abuses, but Doña Pico was a restavek, and she came and she had 5 sons, and she had 2 adopted Haitian children who she gave cedulas, and they were able to go to university. Like, that story also needs to be nuanced a little bit too. And I feel like I've gone far afield from your original question, but can you repeat the question again?
No, I feel like you answered that.
Oh, okay.
I was asking about
the vectors of violence. Well,
also in the case of Duvalier, and if there are more examples other than
okay. Yeah. So the biggest shapeshifting narrative in Haiti has to do with the secret societies. And I thought for a long time this was lore. And then Catherine Smith was like, no, I went to a ritual for the Chien-Mauvais Society, and here's my picture. So the secret society members, of which I have an interview with Hans Nelson in my book, can shape it. And they're bragging about it. This is like a really big thing that they love to brag about. And of course, that bragging, probably that's why the Clément Barbeau, the Tonton Macoute, he probably, there was this merging, shall we say, a lot of chefs de section and also voodoo priests were brought into the Tonton Macoute. He might have been, I don't know about his role. I haven't really studied Clément Barbeau except for that one anecdote, but he was a Tonton Macoute member. And then when Duvalier decided that he didn't like him anymore because he was betraying him, he threw him in jail, and then Barbeau escaped by turning into a black dog, which indicates to me he was definitely secret society. Like he must have been Bizango or something. But so Haitians are possibly, one could argue, they're partly to blame for this Gothic narrative of violence, which Dominicans and other people in the Americas have, because they're bragging. I mean, Hans Nelson bragged to me that he could turn into a wheelbarrow, a dog, a cow, a pig, like, that's part of their pride, is that they're super powerful. And shapeshifting is one of their unique attributes. I mean, there's much more to be said on the Haitian side of this. I did some of that work, but most of my book is kind of thinking about the stories from the Dominican side of the border. So more to be said on that. But it wasn't. But the secret societies, they exist, and they have rituals. They are a network in Haiti, very important network, much like the bacá in Cuba. Like all the Cuban drummers are bacá, and they start when they meet. They have the secret handshake. That's for real. And I know that because Francisco Aguabella, who was an Abacuá conguero from Cuba, he was taught at UCLA for many years. So I heard stories about him, but that's a thing. I mean, it's not a joke. Like Abacuá is a thing, and that's a very similar, or Palamonte, But I think Abacuá and the secret society of Haiti, this is part of an Afro-Atlantic tradition. And there's a lot of pride with the power afforded by being a member of the Bizongo or the Abacuá. So anyway, there's much more to say about that, but I hope that clarified it a little bit.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, like, at the beginning of your research, like how much knowledge you had of like traditional religion or traditional voodoo, and like how that knowledge kind of like changed throughout your research, or like how long it took you to like kind of solidify like the story that you wanted to tell in the book.
It took me a long time. This is a slow food book. But I also have written a number of, bacá pops up, and I've got like 4 articles on bacá in other shapes and forms, so in different contexts. But the animal stories, this is the first time I encountered the animal ones, and it took me a long time to figure it out. I was like, you're hearing these stories about these, animals that appear and disappear. What's also interesting about the environmental history aspects, of some of you are interested in memory and the environment, is that in many of my informants, the bacá, which is a extinct animal, appears next to an extinct species of wood. So, the Caribbean, Jamaica, and Hispaniola were major sources for precious logwoods like mahogany. And so some of my narratives, the bacá appears on mahogany, which I also thought was really interesting. I didn't do anything with that detail, but it kind of underscores this way in which these are memories of the environment, So I was familiar with religion because in my first book on the Trujillo regime, I started, learning about the cofradías, going on pilgrimage, because I have a chapter on this particular faith healer who was killed by the U.S. Marines in 1920, and his faith continues in this part of the border, which I love, this part of the border. It's really magical. It's considered witchy. It's considered the central Brujeria also, San Juan de la Maguana. So it took me a long time to figure this stuff out. I found it really messy. And the other thing, even down to the copy editing phase, like my copy editor would be like, your country, he says this, and then he says this, and I'm like, these are stories. Like they don't all add up. And I had to sit with that. Like I had to accept that, I eliminated a lot of stories that didn't fit my reading, but at the same time, there are contradictions. There are different versions. Sometimes the bacá is protective, sometimes it's invisible theft, sometimes it's fugitivity. It's like, and that's oral culture, So I had to kind of have my copy editor just calm down a little bit about that problem. Thank you, though. Well, we've got all these big questions too.
Hi, I'm interested in how you use different disciplines. Like you used Freud, Marx, and other philosophers, anthropologists into your argument. I wanted to know why you decided to do that and how you feel that helps to explain history.
Well, I had to be resourceful because there's no extended study of the baka. It appears in a little footnote from the ethnographies from the 1940s. There's a chapter in one contemporary voodoo book. There's nothing in English on Dominican voodoo, like nothing. So I had to be really resourceful. Freud writes about trauma and dreams and nightmares. I was like, Freud works. I also use literary theory because the genre of Gothic beauty, that's popped up in literary studies. And so that was like, okay, here I have a language for talking about this, because after the Haitian Revolution, of course, Haiti becomes the Bêtes Noires of the entire Atlantic, because it brought down slavery. And, France imposed an indemnity. Sarah Johnson in her book on Fear of French Egos talked about how even the rhythms associated with Haiti, like the plena was like banned in Puerto Rico. Like they were, this is part of a long history, I think. But at the same time, they're also revered as having special powers. So I think I had to, because nobody had really done this extensive kind of study, I had to just find whatever theory I could find. Because there's nothing on Dominican voodoo, I went to the better studied Afro-Cuban religions, so the work on Palomonte, which is also spirit work, and also the bacá stuff. Although there's actually a lot more written on bacá, but it's not dissimilar. You're still dealing with the spirit world. So I kind of reached towards the better studied, Cuba and to some extent Haiti to flesh this out. But I'm like, whatever theory works, I will use. I mean, one of my readers said, why are you using so much Freud? I think Freud is pretty helpful. I'm kind of a Freud fan. I'm not gonna get rid of Freud anytime soon. Especially when you're dealing with the dark side. You're dealing with fear and and anxiety. And I think Freud is like fair game. Absolutely.
I'm going to propose a composite question.
Okay.
Based on Diana's, Aranza's, and Lucia's questions that all touch on different aspects of working with communities. So questions such as, how do you avoid repeating the idea that the Taino people are gone? How do you envisage returning knowledge to collaborators? How do you share your findings with interlocutors? So I'm clustering together these questions that have to do with the community-related aspects of your work, and of course, the people who ask the questions and others are welcome to expand on.
So I know a lot of anthropologists bring their work back and have a face-to-face with their informants. Unfortunately, it took so long that Doña Pico has dementia. Roman, who appears in he's one of my favorite informants. I love Roman, but he also has dementia. Like it just took too long with my book, so I can't really do that. But I published it. I've translated it to Spanish, and I'm going to have it published in the Dominican Republic. Now, the problem though is that Dominicans don't have cultural history, so they don't really know what to make of my work. It's funny because I was thinking about this in relation to the Barbados and Jamaica has big, strong cultural studies, but they don't really have anthropology much either. Mm-hmm. So I get classed as like folklore, right? But I'm using theory that is kind of strange, and I get my work is hard for Dominicans to read, but I'm fully committed to getting it out there in Dominican circles, because I want to help them, open the door to cultural studies and cultural history. Now, the community thing, I kind of failed because I just took too long. I mean, I will go back to Monica and present. I've sent the book out to everyone. I've sent it to my Haitian people too. So the book is, I've gifted everyone the book, but nobody in Monica speaks English except for one guy who was returned. They returned the prisoners in the 80s. They started doing this. So there's this one guy who was in jail in New York for drug trafficking for like a decade, and then they deported him, and he's in Monica, and he's the only guy who speaks English. I don't know what he would think about this, because drug trafficking appears as bad in the book. So I don't know about that. But the community part, I think I kind of missed the boat on that because I took too long. I am doing some community events. I'm doing a book launch in a Dominican restaurant in LA. And the community issue is complicated because of like the first Dominican restaurant I went to, I was like, can I buy food and show pictures from my book? And she's like, oh, I'm an evangelical. I'm not having you bring spirit demons in my restaurant. So that failed. So now I'm learning how to pitch my book a little differently when I approach the next restaurant. So, you know, I mean, I want to share the results with the community, but bacá is gonna be tougher because so many of my people are no longer there. But I'm gonna try and do that with this gradually growing community of Dominicans in LA who don't really have an identity because people they think they're Cuban because they live in the Cuban area and of course they have different food. So that's why the restaurants are really important, like place for Dominican identity. There was another part of the question that I didn't miss.
The Taínos.
Oh, the Taínos. Well, this is very interesting. So I've recently been doing the kind of indigenous twist in my work. And what I think is so interesting, the Taino practices around spirit work are very apparent. And I first cottoned onto this, for those of you who have read about Haitian vodou, Maya Durant has a chapter on indigenous presence in the sorcery part of voodoo. So it's sort of like, oh, this is interesting. And then I looked at the use of these, I mean, Taino had these semis, they were spirit objects in which you could implant a spirit. In old Dominicans, underneath the altar, they have little dishes of water with spirits and this with rocks, and the rocks are used in healing. This is also the case. William Bascom has an article about the use of stones as healing tools in which is indigenous, I think, in Cuba. It's one of my favorite articles on. It's just like 5 pages, and it's just about the stones, but it's fantastic. I think that's a link. And of course, the Taino. When I started looking for Taino traces, they're everywhere. The food system today is Taino. The names of the plants are Taino, of course, because the conquistadores, even though they wanted to eat a lot more meat than the Taino, they had to take over the food system because the Taino knew how to deal with cassava, which can kill you if you don't know how to, take the toxins out of it. So that is a place, the foods, the plants, place names, the caves. There's an immense system of caves in the Caribbean, and Bacá actually has this huge cave with and if you go into the interior portals, there are indigenous paintings. So I mean, when I started looking for the Taino presence, I saw it everywhere, and I was like, it's hard because as Caribbeanists, we're trained like the Taino disappeared, So it took me a long time in my career to see it, but it's absolutely there. Yeah.
Follow-ups, Professor Batista.
So what you said about the community in Los Angeles, the person was like, no, I don't want to hear about this. Reminded me of one of the interviews. Because as we know, every Dominican Haitian believes in these practices, even though people hide them. And that guy said, no, I believe in God, and a different person. So I wanted to ask about the syncretism of these practices and the secrecy. So just a two-part question. One was, what does it do to the notion of secrecy by publishing about these stories?
Mm.
And then the second thing is, as much as these are narratives about power, it's also about speaking a different truth to power and therefore subverting power to a certain extent. And so are these, you call them narratives, also tools for the weapons of the weak, if you will, to actually enact power?
That's a great point. I mean, that's like this one particular idiom of like resistance. I mean, the Tontumacu who escapes from jail, Macandal who escapes from. So that's a really important element of, I think, of the Haitian bacá corpus. And I really like the way you put it. And it's tricky. I mean, I'm worried about that a little bit. I'm sure. I mean, on the one hand, I feel like every Haitian bacá Dominican that I know has a bacá story. They've all, this has found its way into their life, but at the same time, it is supposed to be kept in the dark. It's not supposed to come into the light. And my Haitian research assistant, he said, kind of really some. I had a fall and I broke I busted my hand right after the Day of the Dead, and he was like, It's the book. And that's the kind of story that I would tell myself, like they didn't want to shine light on them. They're punishing them big time. So it's tricky. Whatever, I don't know. We'll have to see. I'm curious to see how the Dominican community receives this, and I'm curious to see how the Haitian community receives it. And as I said earlier, it was a little bit, I love the cover, but it's a Haitian photograph, and I'm worried that the Dominicans won't recognize it as a book about the deer, even though it is. And I don't know about the politics of that. I'm a little concerned about that too. So I don't know. We'll see. But I like the way you put it as a technique of resistance to power. Because absolutely, these are the subaltern forms of resistance. Yeah. So great point.
Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jaden. I study film, and I'm really interested in sci-fi and fantasy and also mythology of different groups. So this made me curious, after different questions of the secrecy, could this even be made or has it been made into a visual form that people either keep into their families, whether it's like a student creating a short film of their experience or a family member's experience with that? Like, I'm curious as this happens, and would people even enjoy or appreciate if they made into a visual format?
Well, one thing that struck me when I really started collecting these stories is that they're not visualized.
Yeah.
They're just not. Nobody could describe to me. They see it as an animal or they see it as a little black man. They don't see it as so it's different than the visual, the power of the visual in our ghost narratives. We're in a different space. Now, that said, for example, my former student, Alex Weiss, has done a book on, which is about Colombia and climate activists, and he's looking at these visiones that these Colombians had. They're pure dreams. That idiom you do have. They're pure dreams. But I've never. They're, as I say, they're like more sensorially. So, but he hired a Colombian graphic designer to do cartoons about this, and I thought it was pretty brilliant. I don't know of any Dominican artists who could do that, but I think that would be a really cool enterprise. And I will say you could jump from that genre. There's a lot of these bacá spirit demons appear in Haitian Dominican literary works. And so that might be a jumping off place for representing them through a graphic novel. I think that would be super cool. So go for it.
And to Jaden's question, one of the greatest Latin American novels ever is Paradiso by José Lezama Lima, a Cuban, and he writes around El Gran Cení. So this wooden taíno sculpture of a tobacco was at the center of El Gran Cení of Paradiso. Do we have other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you so much. Really fantastic talk and book, of course. So my question is just methodological. As you said, it took a long time to figure out what these bacás were, and the storytelling. And so in your book, you take this longue durée approach, and you try to explain it, from the trauma of the conquest and use of animals as weapons, by the colonizers and stuff. So I wonder, in your positionality, how are you able to know from your informants that this is still present in this past trauma, because like I assume like some of these interviews, like what we saw in there, I'm not sure, is he really explaining this, because of trauma that happened 200 years ago?
Yeah.
So how do you sort of figure that out? How do you sort of make that claim?
Yeah, this is where returning to the community and having the dialogic, with the informants wouldn't fly, because they will say that they appear as these things, but then they wouldn't see it as part of the trauma complex. So that's ultimately an argument I can't really clinch, except why would these animals only become? When I went to my informant Hans Nelson, who's a sorcerer, and I have his interview, although he in bragging that he could turn into anything, he breaks the rules that I'm developing my argument. But that's because these guys are big braggers. And, you know, so like, that's why I had to kind of talk a little bit about the braggadocio that, you know, these sorcerers have, which is like a thing. It's like, oh yeah, I can do it all, you know? So, but yeah, that's a problem. I mean, at the end of the day, this argument would be kind of indecipherable for them. So that's where my, you know, the community, returning to the community and doing that kind of dialogic, I don't think would really fly. They can't, I don't think they would see it the same way. You know, because we're social scientists, right? And we develop arguments. I don't know, but we'll see. When I do my community event, I'm going to give them, you know, the fukú of Colón, and let's see what they say. I don't know. See, that'll be an interesting experiment.
Hey, thank you. I was really curious about this question. Who these stories are serving, and I think it goes back a little bit to sort of this subaltern thing that you mentioned, and sort of resistance. But I couldn't help but think that in some of the stories, you're kind of extracting responsibility. So when he was talking about the bacá following him, you know, after he was given the money, like if something had happened to him, would the fault be of the person who sent the bacá or the bacá, and in that way, sort of, where does that place sort of accountability, or just like who you're able to blame? Same way that I wonder if he's thinking about that you described the monster, the horse and the dog and the colonizer, sort of like this one monster. Like, are these stories being told alongside the sort of like stories of like deep brutality by colonizers, or are they sort of serving as a way to sort of separate, to explain away or to sort of avoid the act of violence from?
Well, you know, first of all, I think I'm trying to say that these spirit demons can serve many different needs. You know, at times, I think the packs of bacás streaming over the border from Haiti, that's anti-Haitianism. Like, sorry, that's definitely anti-Haitianism. But we also have these elements of, you know, as Rachel said, of like subaltern hidden agency. So it's there's no one bottom line, because they could serve many different ends. And there's one chapter where I talk about this one story that I problematize because it's complicated. So this guy whose nickname is Columbus, for the Fukú de Colón, like, this was kind of interesting. I met him, and he was this old blind guy, and he told me about these stories of this invisible thievery. So these packs of bacás would come to the oil processing plant and like steal product to the point where it was like really hurting the yields of the plant. And I was like, this doesn't really fit with my other narratives. And then I returned to this town and had a conversation with some guys, and they were like, that was part of Trujillo's network of industrial plants. Like, this guy was, you know, he was torturing people. He was a Trujillista. He was peeling their nails off of them. And so I have a chapter, I'm like kind of considering this, how this bottom line, which I understand, having done a book on Trujillo, I know how Dominicans love to accord all sorts of agency to Trujillo. But I said to myself, I wonder if this kind of invisible thievery has to do with the fact that Colón himself may have felt victimized. Like, everybody else was making money on this, blood money on this plant, and he was just getting the manager's salary. I mean, I think it's complicated, and Dominicans love to have this idea that everything Trujillo was doing, was responsible for everything. And in this chapter, I kind of say, this could have been a motif of Colón kind of saying, like, dude, the owner of the plant, who was Trujillo's henchman, was making all this money that I didn't get, which it accounts for the invisible thievery story, because they were stealing in effect from Colón. So I kind of try to problematize that question of agency, but I didn't have, because my kids were growing up when I was doing this book, and I couldn't go, like, I stayed for 1 month, the first month, and then I just went back and do like a week-long trip. So I didn't have, that was the only opportunity I had to kind of revisit a story and hear it in a different register. But I do at least in one chapter just kind of say, hey, this could be this, it could be this. There's an interpretive impossibility. You can't really, with cultural history and memory, you can't really have a necessarily bottom line. So at least I try to address that to the extent that I can.
I might slide in a question myself. So we've seen how the bacá are not animals, and they are animals. I wonder if you could tell us more about how they're objects. And what I'm thinking about is something like the vigilant things in the Yoruba tradition.
Oh, yeah.
You know, which are similar in some ways, right? So yes, we don't have the visual representation. Could you maybe talk a little more about the materiality, the bacás, an object?
Well, so this project has put me in a new project, which maybe is good to think about this through the Ale's material, which is this. I got interested. I'm now moved from kind of animals, plants, and there is a Palo de Cruz. Well, first of all, there's Haitian and Dominican magical plants. I mean, there's a lot on Corinthianismo, but there's very little on magical plants. But what's interesting is from what I've seen, pretty much the Haitian kind of grammar of magical plants is completely shared. And, you know, partly I think because for decades and centuries, Haitian slaves migrated to the Dominican Republic. So if you go into the world of magical plants, it's really Haitian magical plants. That's the grammar. But these so the Palo de Cruz is a great example of something that is seen and unseen. So the first thing is it's a plant with apparently that makes little crosses, and you plant it in front of your house and it will keep zombies and bacás and all sorts of demonic spirits away. But then I'm going into the literature and there's a huge discrepancy that nobody can agree on which plant it is. So then I was like, okay, what's the common denominator? Because a lot of people who write on plants in Corinthianismo, of course, are doctors. And so there's this doctor who wrote a book and he says, well, it must be this plant because this has the most, you know, hydrotropic properties. Like, I think he's wrong, but whatever. But so then I'm looking at the common denominator, and it's interesting because the common denominator seems to be the color red. Mm-hmm. And red, of course, is associated with cochineal, and Mayan slaves came to the DR. Tainos used red paint to go into battle. And then also, I recently visited a garden, what do you call it? You know, a public garden. And it said that this is interesting. So red plants have more pollen, so they attract more insects. And I know that the Taino hunted with fireflies. So I thought, and I know that beekeeping was a big thing among the Mayans. So I don't know, I think now I have to go to insects, but that's an interesting example of materiality of something that's magical, that's there. But if you don't know, you're not going to know that plant is keeping zombies away. So that might be a good, but you know, there's also like in my Trujillo book, so I did interviews with people so Trujillo expanded the city of Santo Domingo like hugely. And so one of the things I tried to do was I went into neighborhoods of people who were in these newly founded barrios, and I was trying to figure out who got apartments, who didn't. And as it turns out, the military, his military, they're the ones who got apartments. But in my questionnaire, because I always worked with a questionnaire, my final question would be, so what is the secret of Trujillo's longevity in office? And so the women said, well, he had a cop that told him that he, you know, who his enemy were, and he knocked them off. Mm-hmm. And so, and then I was like, well, as a cultural historian, I needed more than one or two or three interviews. And then I started asking Dominican assembly workers in Chicago, and that story also popped up. So I was like, okay, now I have maybe not 10, but I have a bunch of interviews. It's far flung. So that, I mean, that's an interesting example of it's not materiality as such, but you know, he had this little black guy who was telling him. So I don't know, that doesn't answer your question. I think the plant is more appropriate for thinking about the materiality, and that's something I'm just beginning to think about. So
this connects to Cia's question earlier about interdisciplinarity, because your work connects to botany, mm-hmm. to ethnography, to material culture, anthropology, cultural studies, religious studies, and for that we're very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
A small gift from Bolivar House.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I
And-
appreciate it.
And I'm also, with mixed feelings, have to report that this concludes the class Friday speaker series for winter quarter. We will resume in the spring. This is week 6 here of 10 at Stanford. So we still are going to be working together in various projects, but as it happens, this is the end of our series for this quarter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Words. Word check.